We've been looking at some rather interesting issues in the last couple of weeks, and as you know, there was a kind of a general introduction, or maybe some of you are just here for the first time, but there was a general introduction the first Sunday that I was with you, and we talked about the Holocaust as a problem for Christians for a complex set of interacting reasons. Some of those reasons have to do with the questions raised about God, which we talked about last week. Some of those reasons have to do with discovering things about the history of our own institution, the church. And some of those things have to do with what we find in our own scriptures that are sometimes uncomfortable. What I want to do today is to look at the issue of our relationship to this difficult history and what we discover there and how we might move forward with some very uncomfortable knowledge. And perhaps the best way I can put this is to go back to the scene in Hamlet, which I'm probably beating to death for you, but it's a powerful scene. Hamlet in Act 2, Scene 2, is talking to Guildenstern, and he's saying to Guildenstern that the sacred canopy above him has simply become a foul congregation of vapors. In other words, the way in which his world holds together has fallen completely apart. He has discovered that his mother and his uncle had a role in the poisoning of his father. He already was caught up in the grief. And then he discovered, with this wonderful scene where his wandering ghost in the castle informs him of what has happened, that his mother and his uncle had something to do, had everything to do with his father's death. Now, I'd like to suggest to you that image is helpful still for us today, particularly as we think about what happens when we learn from history that our tradition has more to do with what happened in 1933 to 1945 than any of us want to know. And let me introduce it by telling you a story and try to unpack it, and then we'll visit a biblical text to see if we can let that text help us make sense of this. In 1988, I was participating in an international conference of Holocaust scholars in Oxford, England. It was a week-long conference. Scholars from all over the world were there, and we had multiple seminar sessions that were planned. In one of these seminar sessions, we were looking at theology and its relationship to questions raised by the Holocaust. There were about 17 of us who had all written papers for this particular set of discussions. And I had been given the dubious role in this particular session of being the rapporteur. It was a fancy name for secretary. I was taking notes. So it meant I was paying real close attention to who the people were sitting around the table. And to this day, I can still chart the table because the experience that afternoon had such a powerful impact for me. I was in an old seminar room of Wadham College, which is one of the older colleges at Oxford. And I think the room hadn't been renovated or cleaned for several centuries. There were residues of lots of conversations in that room. And I must tell you, it was just a strange affair. There were the 17 discussants sitting around the table. And then we had about twice as many observers who were in the room sitting in chairs back against the wall. But we also had more observers than chairs. So if you can, imagine that we've got this very large table, and around it, across the table from me to my left, I'm looking at Roy and Alice Eckhart, two very important Christian theologians who wrestle with this topic. Roy and Alice are the authors of a very important book called Long Day's Journey into Night that was terribly important for anybody like me who wrestles with this topic. Roy Eckhart is the founder of the American Academy of Religion, which is the large academic association that any of us who do religious scholarship happen to participate in. So I was impressed. I'm at the table with Roy, and I looked around, and there was Bishop Harries sitting off the table back against the wall, the Episcopal Bishop of the Diocese of Oxford. I recognized him. As you make your way around the table, 3 people down from me was Richard Rubenstein, probably the preeminent Jewish scholar, raising questions about the Holocaust and God's role and relationship in it. So I was new to this enterprise at that point, and I was excited about my conversation companions. I also was tickled by the fact that this wonderful little lady named Dr. Ruth, the psychologist, had borrowed my briefcase as a chair. She was sitting back off to my right. It was just a very interesting combination of people. And our job was to kind of summarize our papers and raise questions and try to evoke good conversation. Now, you have to imagine that this is one of those places where the biggest danger happens to be the egos in the room. It was a danger that was left behind almost immediately, because Roy Eckhart was summarizing his concerns that Christians need to grapple with this topic like we've been doing. And this is 2007. That was 1988. And Richard Rubenstein interrupted him, and he said, with as much force as I can capture, I'm sick and tired of you Christians wallowing in your guilt. Get over it. Now, can you imagine what happened next? There was a frozen room. What do we do with this? But Roy Eckhart took only about 20 seconds to respond, Richard, we can't get over it because we haven't faced it. We have to deal with this. We have to keep raising this question because most Christians don't even know the history. Richard said. But do you know what kind of box that puts me in? Do you know we can't have a decent relationship if the only reason you relate to me is because you feel guilty? I'm sick and tired of you relating to me, you meaning Christians, because you just feel guilty. You don't see me, you see your own guilt. Pretty powerful, isn't it? Well, we eventually got back to our papers, and I was dutifully taking my notes, worrying about what had happened to my briefcase. It really got squashed. She promised me a new one, and I'm still waiting. But what didn't leave me was that encounter. It is still fresh. It is so fresh, I can tell you where everybody in the room was sitting. One of those kinds of events. And here's what had me hooked. What if they're both right? And I kept thinking, if they're both right, there's something about how they're right that isn't right. You ever in situations where you get two polemical positions which are bumping heads against each other, and you realize that when you listen to one, you say, yeah, that's right. Then you listen to another and you say, yeah, that's right too. But you can't put them together. That was one of those moments. And I kept wondering, what is it? What is it about this encounter that is instructive? And finally, it hit me. I was born in 1948. So there isn't any way guilt makes sense for what I feel and experience about this. And that's true for a lot of folks. There are a lot of people who were sitting around that table who weren't in positions, even though they were living during the war, where guilt made sense for them either, because they were not in a position to act. And I began to think, what if the issue isn't guilt, but something else? What if it has more to do with shame, not guilt? Now, my work has, in getting my own degree years earlier, it helped me differentiate the dynamics of shame versus the dynamics of guilt. Guilt has to do with behavior, things we do or things we don't do that we have responsibility for. And it's only appropriate for us to feel guilt for something we've done, caused to be done, or not done that we can apologize for, ask forgiveness for, or make amends for. And in addition, we feel guilt only because we've got a strong sense of who we are and we've let ourselves and others down. And we feel more guilt because of our understanding of ourselves. Identity is required for guilt. Shame, on the other hand, is an encounter with an aspect of yourself that you aren't prepared to see or understand, Shame is an exposure to a vulnerability about who you are and often about your identity where you feel seen behind the scenes, that someone sees an aspect of who you are you would rather not acknowledge. Or if you use the work of developmental psychologists, shame is related to identity, more precisely, identity in relationship. It has to do with how you relate to other people. It's tied into things like embarrassment, saving and losing face. And in fact, one of the most common phenomena of all when people experience levels of shame in a public situation, they blush, right? It has to do with the face. This was helpful for me because I realized that what I've been having to wrestle with has to do with how I understand myself as a Christian in relationship to Jews and in relationship to a history. The more I learn about, the more problematic that relationship with others becomes. Let me illustrate it with another story. And there's a connection with Boston Avenue United Methodist Church in this one. In 1995, I spent a number of days in Auschwitz-Birkenau. That's the large death camp that's Camp 2 associated with Auschwitz. I was part of a program that was commemorating the 50th anniversary of the liberation of the camps. And one of the people who was there with me on the program was a man named Gottfried Wagner. Now, Gottfried Wagner's great-grandfather named Richard Wagner, the composer. And I had gotten to know Gottfried a number of years earlier, and we were good friends. We're 8 months apart in age. We have talked long into the night, many nights, about this phenomenon of shame versus guilt. And it has been helpful for Gottfried, because in Gottfried's case, here is a person who himself is a musical genius, but he refuses to move into the arena of composition. He has a doctorate from the University of Vienna in musicology. He stages opera productions, but he works almost exclusively with Jewish composers. Let me tell you why, and then I'll finish my story. When Gottfried was 9 years old, he came home from school in Bayreuth, Germany, and had been exposed to films of what had been transpiring in Nazi Germany as part of the educational program that was post-World War II responsibilities. And he came home, like many 9-year-olds, with lots of questions for his mom and dad. But in this case, the questions had to do with, these films say that Hitler was a friend of our family. These films say that my great-grandfather was responsible for X, Y, and Z. He was asking questions that were rather pointed about the family. And his father told him, this is just Allied nonsense. Put the blame on Germans. And he was dismissed. You almost have to know Gottfried to appreciate the next step. He went out into the garage almost an hour after this conversation and went rummaging around old family memorabilia because he wasn't satisfied with the answer he got. And he started searching through a motorcycle sidecar and found tins of 16 millimeter film. He would open and he would hold the film up and look. And as he did, he discovered it was family films. And in the family films, it was his grandmother, primarily, and Adolf Hitler, chatting, walking about the grounds, lots and lots of footage of his grandmother with Hitler. Eventually, he found love letters. This later as an adult, he found love letters when he went through some of his family's things between Adolf Hitler and his grandmother. And in one letter, a proposal of marriage. His grandmother turned Hitler down because if she remarried, she gave up being in control of the Wagner estate. It was part of the inheritance. Now, Gottfried Wagner was a person who, like me, born after the war and has no physical behavior responsibility for anything that happened. Guilt would be inappropriate. But he had discovered his grandmother was Hitler's first love. His grandmother had supplied the typewriter and the paper for the writing of Mein Kampf. That his great-grandfather's music had provided much of the energy for Nazi Germany, and his books supplied much of the rationale for the anti-Semitic beliefs of Adolf Hitler. Gottfried was a walking example of the dilemma. In order for Gottfried to lay claim to who he was as a person, he's still a Wagner. He has these incredible gifts with music. And if you look at him, he's a spitting image of his great-grandfather when he turns for a side profile. His great-grandfather was short, Gottfried's 6 feet tall. But apart from that, it looks like a modern version of Richard Wagner. Now, in 1945, we are in the middle of this incredibly overwhelming place. And on this particular day, it was the anniversary of the death of the father and mother and 2 sisters of a man in whose kitchen I had been staying for 4 days prior to the beginning of the conference. Bernard Offen. He lighted a yahrzeit candle in the remains of the gas chamber area in Birkenau to remember his father. And then after it was all over, he grabbed my arm and he grabbed Gottfried's and he said, "Walk with me out of the camp." So we walk with him to the gate. We get to the gate. Bernard needs to go to another location to give a lecture. And Gottfried and I move to the side. All of the people disappear. They go in to hear Bernard. And Gottfried collapses in my arms with the most gut-wrenching weeping I've ever seen a grown man have. And out of his mouth comes this statement: my family is responsible for all of this. Now, Gottfried himself wasn't responsible for that, but he was touching his sense of connection to his family. It was an experience of shame, not guilt. I want you to know that Gottfried, now a reactivated Roman Catholic, sat in the third seat behind the camera 2 Easters ago in here. And soaked up your energy with me as he's made his journey back. But what it has required of him is facing his family's complicity, his family's involvement, and realizing that he can't escape being a Wagner. He can't escape looking like Richard Wagner. He can't escape his own musical genius. It's a burden he lives with, but he's found wholeness. And I would suggest to you the way he's done that is by facing the past and his family's involvement in it. And that sounds terribly simple, but it's all caught up in the power of the metaphor facing. He's allowed the human stories of the people who were killed in Birkenau or who were victimized by what his family participated in. He has let them take root in his own identity, and he's learned to embrace them in spite of the pain. Let me give you the biblical example that he's been following. I think I can do this without my glasses. I brought my large print. Genesis 32. I think you'll recognize the passage. The same night he got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything that he had. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved." The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the thigh muscle that is on the hip socket, because he struck Jacob on the hip socket at the thigh muscle. my friend Gottfried, Christians like me, and maybe some of you, for whom this issue has become a source of a measure of shame, wrestle with the other. And in this case, the other is our Jewish other. And we wrestle with the other who is inside of us. And we wrestle with the other who is our parent or our brother and sister. We wrestle with the other who could be a side of ourselves we really don't want to face. And as we wrestle, we take hold and we say, I will not let go of you until you bless me. I would contend that in this story, if you think about what happened to Jacob, Jacob faced a lifetime in one night, but it had all been coming for quite some time. You remember the story. Jacob had betrayed his brother Esau by stealing his birthright, claiming the blessing that his father had for his brother as his own. And then he had fled his home because when Esau found out what had happened, Esau said, I'm going to kill you. So for 20 years, Jacob lived in servitude to his uncle Laban. And when he found that things might be better, he returned, but he returned with a measure of fear. In the chapter just before this one, he sent sheep, livestock, belongings, servants over ahead of him to be a gift to Esau to placate his brother. Moved his family away because he was afraid of what his brother might do, and he slept by himself on the riverbank. Now think what happens if you begin to look at this text and you start asking questions like, who is the man with whom Jacob wrestled? The text is fascinatingly rich because the man is never named. Jacob wants to know, but the man says, why do you need to know? Folks, the old Jacob would have needed to know so he could be in control. But the new Jacob let it go. Didn't let go of the man. He let go of trying to control the man. The man asked, who are you? And Jacob took the risky path and said, my name is Jacob. My name is heel sneak, which is what Jacob means. And he received a new name, Israel, because the man said, you've striven with God and with men and survived or prevailed. So the man adds that there's something sacred you've been struggling with, not just something human. And then Jacob does an incredibly interesting thing. He names the place, but not the man. The old Jacob would have named the man, but he named the place, Penuel, which literally means face of God. And he leaves limping. Now, if you read this text as a Jew, and you read it with a rich understanding of Hebrew, this notion of limping has lots of double and triple entendres. because Jews follow something called halakha. I think I've mentioned this to you before. Law. But the word halakha is the nominative form of the verb to walk. So all Jews, if they are faithful, are committed to a certain way of walking. A way of walking according to precepts, ordinances, commandments. And in those precepts and ordinances, the way of walking is very specific about how you live your life with others in your home, even to specify how to cook, what to eat. It's very specific about how to treat people in your home and how to live in an agrarian world. How to grow seeds, how not to mix seeds. And if we think it's just simply living by a list of rules, we've got it backwards. It's a way of saying there is no place in our ordinary existence where we cannot honor God and walk with God. So it's a way of saying any ordinary routine thing we do can be a way of walking with God. And here's a story that tells you about Israel's beginning, where the name Israel comes from. And it says, if you're Israel, how do you walk? You limp. It's a wounded walk. If you read the Hebrew Scriptures, you're struck by how these people have remembered all the ways they have stumbled throughout their history, their walk with God. Now, double click on this hot text, limp, like you would at your computer, and go from that word to Micah 6:8. What does God require of you but to do justice, to love steadfastly, or to do kindness, and to walk humbly with your God? What is humble walking, if not limping? What my friend Gottfried Wagner has learned how to do is to limp. He will always be a Wagner. He will always be German, even though he's chosen to live in Milan, Italy, and not to be in charge of the Bayreuth Wagner Festival. It's no different than what happens for white Americans when they come to terms with their relationship to the racism in our country. We've got some aspects of our history that we can't change. What we can do is change how we relate to it. And so the knowledge may lead us to limp. I grew up in the Deep South. It was segregated. I went to the University of Alabama when there were only 20 African American students, and I played football on a team that wasn't integrated. That's part of my wounded history. I can't change it. If I'm going to embrace with pride having played ball at Alabama, I get the whole story, not just the parts I like. Right? If we look at the history of this state, we get the whole history, not just the part we like. We get the problematic relationships with Native Americans. And in Tulsa, we have to deal with what happened in the 1920s. We get the whole history. But the secret is, we don't have to be hooked by guilt, but we may be bumping into shame. And the dynamics there are identity dynamics, learning that we've never been asked to be perfect, just whole. And the path forward is a path of humility. These dynamics are present anytime we deal with the other because they force us to ask, do we build our identities over against others or with others? Now this may sound heady and philosophical, but I think it's pretty practical. For many years, actually centuries, Christians built their identity as Christians by identifying that we got what was promised to Jews which they lost. We've built our identity with Jews as our negative significant other. We're the ones who got the story right. They're the ones who didn't. It's a different story altogether when it's told as the story of God's gracious embrace of all of creation that was given particular expression in an embrace of the people and then extended to Gentiles through Jesus Christ. We're one of those wonderfully led congregations where the pastor here understands that difference. There are lots of places where it isn't understood. Another way to say it is the identity comes from the inside out. It's not built from the outside in. And it doesn't require putting another down. Now these same kind of dynamics surface in what does it mean to be an American when Native Americans are pushed away by immigrant Americans, and then once immigrant Americans push away other immigrants because they've forgotten they were once immigrant Americans. These are all dynamics that have to do with how do we understand ourselves? Is our identity built on fear or something else? So, if you're thinking, well, he's just messing with all sorts of stuff today, guess what? Scripture messes with all sorts of stuff every day. And anytime we deal with identity before God and before others, we're messing with stuff. Because that's what it's all about. So, think about me, if you would, holding this man as he wept, saying, my family was responsible for all of this. I could have gotten into a factual argument with Gottfried and said, Gottfried, you're wrong. This required centuries of history. It required a whole nation to do this. It wasn't just Hitler. It wasn't just your family. And all of that would be right. But I think the right response that day was just to hold him and let the tears come. And then he was be free to embrace himself and the others in his world. I think that's the struggle we all face when we deal with this topic. It's overwhelming history. We discover that key offenders who treated Jews with malignant contempt are people with names like Martin Luther, St. Augustine, John Chrysostom, Tertullian. Folks, everyone who goes through seminary has to study these people. They're church fathers. They're the heart and core of how we pass on Christian identity. And they were caught up in it too. Every law passed by Germany in 1933 and then up to 35, when they added the definition of what it meant to be a Jew, the only law that was not in church books was the definition of what it meant to be a Jew. Wearing a yellow star came from 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council. Banning laws that banned Gentiles from having Jewish doctors are thousands of years old. They come from Christian canon laws. Once you learn this history, it's unsettling. The notion or the popular image of the devil as this kind of reddish-looking figure with cloven feet and a big nose, that comes out of Christian artists painting Jews as Satan. That's the history that leads to this sense of, how do I make amends? Being honest. Facing it. My own work has led me to the recognition that I'm always going to bump into ways in which I've not expected a knowledge or an understanding to pop up in front of me. Or, to put it another way, I expect to make mistakes about Jewish history and Christian attitudes toward Jews. It is so much a part of Christian history. And what I've learned from that conversation between Richard Rubenstein and Roy Eckhart is that I do my work with Jewish friends. And when I bump into something, they tell me, you know, I don't think you meant this way, but that sounds like the. And then the next question is, what do I do with it? Do I learn from it? Do I say, never intended that, they say. I knew that. Thank you for telling me. And my world gets bigger. It's not the time for me to be defensive, just to acknowledge and to face the shame without being ashamed. I'm embarrassed, but it's the process of working with somebody you respect. So I do my work in dialogue with Jewish sources, with Jewish friends, and with Jewish mentors. I do my work using a style of study called Midrash, which is essentially working with Scripture the same way I just walked you through the story of Jacob at the Jabbok. But in this case, I would take that story and say, for me, the Scriptures are always the other that I take hold of, and I don't dare let go until I'm blessed by wrestling with it. I trust Scripture enough to bring it my fiercest questions. And I limp, which means I recognize it's a flawed walk, it's a flawed journey, and it isn't going to get any better because it's my walk, my woundedness, my imprecise eyes. So I need people to remind me, Knight, you limp. One of my Jewish friends about 6 years ago says, you know, we have this little saying, beware of leaders who don't limp. I think that's probably good advice. So I hope that what we've done in the last 3 weeks has been a way of limping through some of the territory covered by this topic, the Christian problem of the Holocaust. We Christians have a difficult past to integrate. So, let's face it. And in facing it, we limp. But if we limp, we are walking. And we are walking with Israel. We are walking with Jesus, a child of Israel. And we are walking with each other, realizing that all along, this probably is the insight Martin Luther had, just imperfectly, that he is justified by grace while yet a sinner. Simul justus et peccator. The heart of the Reformation insight. It's just that having it, Martin Luther limped too. Well, I thank you for your kind attention. We have a couple of minutes if there are any questions any of you want to ask. But I think I'm going to hold it here for just a moment and see if you've got questions. Yes, ma'am. Why did the Germans deny the Holocaust? Actually, it's probably probably better to say that of all the nations in the world, Germany is foremost in not denying the Holocaust. If you go to Berlin, in the center of the city, you're going to find this huge external memorial that makes it impossible to dodge that question. It's against the law in Germany to deny the Holocaust. I mean, it's a legal law. You can't even engage in propaganda supporting this. And you've got educational programs throughout Germany where German children are being taught about the Holocaust. What's interesting about your question is the irony. Why is it that Germany, which you would think would be a nation that would deny the Holocaust, doesn't? And why is it that the president of a country that didn't persecute Jews from 1933 to 45, that in fact sheltered Jews from 1933 to 45. And there are a number of survivors, and there's in fact one survivor of the Holocaust who is a Tehran Jew, who were put up in Tehran. Why is it that the president of Iran, who has every reason to say the Holocaust happened, because Iran was one of the few countries that supported Jews. So it's backwards. Dachau was leveled, and now there are memorial sites there. There are all sorts of reasons that were operating for people who tore them down, and there are. Germany went through some very interesting times of wanting not to face up to what happened, then having a generation after the children of the folks who fought, who were trying to ask their parents what happened and were frustrated, like my friend Gottfried. And then the generation after that got angry at their parents for not forcing their grandparents to talk to them about it. So what you have to understand is these dynamics in Germany have gone through some interesting evolutions. In the 1960s, for example, there was a very strong movement of German teenagers and college students who were pushing their parent generation to talk about World War II, and they wouldn't. And so they started, we were having our own difficulties with Vietnam during that time, and German society was having its struggle with one generation angry because another generation wouldn't talk about what happened. So part of this is understanding this evolution. One of the most powerful educational experiences or exhibitions I know of is in a place called Wannsee, which is just outside of Berlin. It's the house where Richard Heydrich met with folks to plan the final solution in January of 1942. That house has been set aside as a teaching institution for German youth so that the story of the Holocaust is exhibited. There were one set of minutes that were found from that meeting when this was planned. Those minutes sit under the glass top table. There, as you walk through the building, you've got the story from 1933 to 45 that is told in brief exhibits. And then on the second floor, you have a library and a teaching area, and the development of curriculum that is nationwide, distributed nationwide by the Wannsee Conference Center. But that didn't happen immediately. This dynamic that I shared with between Gottfried's generation and his parents' generation is very real. It wasn't just his was perhaps the biggest kind of celebrity, but it happened in smaller ways. What has happened to what? To Hitler's Bible. I don't know. I just don't know where it would be or any of those sorts of things. Most folks who focused on Holocaust scholarship, and particularly in German scholars, are interested in trying to help people understand that the Holocaust required much more leadership and preparation than just one man, than just Adolf Hitler. So there are some folks who focus their study on Hitler, but most of the people who do this work are trying to say this is more like, if you'll pardon an inadequate metaphor, it's more like a perfect storm. It had a lot of fronts that had to come together. Economic conditions, World War II going on at the same time, the failures of the Weimar Republic, the heavy unemployment, long history of anti-Semitism in Western Europe, and then the circumstances that led to the election of the Nazi Party. So it's a combination of things. You also had to have bureaucracy. You also had to have modern technology. None of these things could have happened without it. Well, we were gradually getting more people. One more question, sir. I can't quite. The observation is that the new anti-Semitism going on now can be dangerous. Yes, it is. But it is not of the same ferocity with all of these other elements in place. We have to be sensitive to it. We have to watch it. We have to check it. And the technology is more dangerous. But the other thing to be thankful for, it's still not 1933. We are needing to break so that folks can prepare for worship. Thank you for your kind attention. Go with God's blessing.